Lovely. Thank you so much, Amanda. Just check everybody can hear me. Please do write in the chat if you can't. As Amanda said, I'm delivering the session today under my banner of resilience across borders. And I've set up resilience across borders on the basis of two approaches. The first is to draw on positive examples. So normally when we want to fix a problem, we try to identify what caused the problem and then try to fix these causes so that that problem won't happen again. And in the peace building world, there's a lot of emphasis on understanding what causes conflict and then trying to remove or reduce these causes of conflict in order to promote peace. Resilience across borders takes a different approach and is based on seeking to understand what really builds resilience and creates peace, and then trying to replicate these factors in order to promote peace and resilience elsewhere. So if we want to build trusting and diverse teams, let's learn from teams that are already trusting and diverse. The second approach of resilience across borders is that the components of resilience are transferable, that the approaches that a community develops to build resilience are applicable in an organisational setting and vice versa. Even if the terminology we use and the specific activities we implement are different, the concepts and approaches are transferable. We can all learn from each other. Hence, in today's webinar, we'll be looking at an example of a trusting and diverse city, the Bosnian city of Tuzla, and exploring what we might be able to learn and transfer from this example to the teams and organisations or even communities that you work with. So the city of Tuzla, the Bosnian War started in April 1992 and ended with the Dayton Agreement in December 1995. And it was, you may remember, some of you, it was a war marked by the appalling term ethnic cleansing, where civilians were forcibly moved from their homes to create ethnically pure parts of the country, as well as concentration camps, rape and sexual violence, and mass murders, including the Srebrenica genocide. And I'll come back to that right at the end of today's session. The city of Tuzla is in the northeast of Bosnia-Herzegovina, not far from the border with Serbia, and was very much on the front line for much of the war. It's an industrial city known partly for its salt mines, and its population at the start of the war was made up of just over 50% of Muslims. Now, Muslims in Bosnia was an ethnic term as well as a religious term. Just under 20% were Serbs, who were predominantly Orthodox Christians, and just under 20% Croats, who were predominantly Catholics, and approximately 10% of people who describe themselves as Yugoslavs, so people of mixed marriages. Now, unlike in most other parts of Bosnia, in Tuzla there was no ethnic cleansing. No one was made to move, no one was persecuted or murdered because of their ethnicity. And I'm going to discuss now how it was that Tuzla was able to resist the forces of nationalism and radicalization when no other place in Bosnia was. So one key aspect of Tuzla was that they had a very clear vision, that the city of the people of Tuzla had a very fierce sense of local identity, of being citizens of Tuzla. And this dated back to long before the war. So the social identity of the people living in the city was of being Tuzlan, not of their individual ethnicity. There was no them and us between the different ethnic groups. And their vision was to maintain their diversity, to maintain the city's multi-ethnic harmony. And everybody lived by this. Everybody bought into this concept, from high-profile leaders through to every citizen. And it permeated every aspect of life. It wasn't just a byproduct of life in Tuzla, something that happened once the economy was sorted or health and education were up and running. It was first and foremost what permeated their life there. So every action, every decision, every speech that was made by a leader was based around achieving this vision as their primary goal. The leadership in Tuzla was very collaborative. Now, there was a charismatic leader, Mayor Bezlacic was the mayor and the elected mayor, and he very much walked the talk of this multi-ethnic identity, of this social cohesion of the city. He started his speeches by saying, people of Tuzla. He didn't use nationalistic language that other leaders in Bosnia did. And he played to their social identity as Tuzlans, as united members of the city, as did the other leaders of the city. And the mayor gave people a choice. At the start of the war, he recognized that there were some tensions, and he said, look, if you want to go. And that was for city workers, that was for units from the Bosnian army. If you want to go, go. If you can't buy into our multi-ethnic harmony, you go and fight with other forces or go and flee. But if you stay on the basis that you are defending our multi-ethnic city, and most stayed. He established a war cabinet, and every day he met with fellow leaders in the city authorities. He met with heads of the military. He met with the head of the chief of police. He met with religious leaders, and together they discussed the challenges that lay ahead, and they made collective decisions about how they were going to address those challenges. They were very visible. The mayor and his fellow leaders were very visible in the city. They very much kind of walked the streets, and they communicated in a very empathetic way. They listened to what people were saying to them. They listened to people's concerns. But they were also very clear about the challenges that lay ahead for the city. They quashed rumours in any kind of conflict zone, any kind of area where there's violence. There's always a lot of rumours. They quashed those rumours. They're also very clear in their instructions to the people of Tuzla. This is what we need you to do. We need you to go to work every day. We need you to stay in your homes. Do not exchange your properties with anybody else. And I'll come on to that in a moment. They were also very, very careful in their use of language. They took great care to use non-polarizing language. So the city was under attack quite a lot they were very close to the front line, and they were under attack from Serb forces. But they were very careful that they didn't refer to them as Serbian forces, because they knew that that might have an impact on the Serbian citizens living in Tuzla. They might be associated with those aggressors. So they called them by different names, the aggressors, the Chetnik, something that didn't associate them with their Serb neighbours. The city had some very clear policies and procedures, and in particular around their human resource policy for their public institutions. So all public institutions had to have and maintain a diverse, multi-ethnic workforce. And the police chief took this very seriously and not only maintained a multi-ethnic workforce, he actually increased the ethnic diversity. He recruited more Serb police officers during the war to balance out. It had been a predominantly Muslim police force at the start of the war. So that was really quite unusual. And there was very, very strict adherence to the rule of law throughout Tuzla. The police were kept separate from the military. They weren't co-opted into the ethnic violence. They were kept very separate from that. So they continued to focus on civilian rule of law and dealt with crime as it occurred. So they maintained their hold on civilian crime. And they were very careful that this didn't become politicized. It didn't become ethnically based crime. So, for example, quite early in the war, there was the Orthodox bishop's palace was broken into. Now, he was a Serbian, and so although this may have been random crime, it may have been a specific attack on a Serbian person, but the mayor made it very clear that this was to be treated as a normal criminal attack. This was an attack on civilian property in Tuzla. As I said early on in the war, the mayor said to people that wanted to leave, do go if you want to. And some people did. Some Serbian people did, mainly because perhaps they felt the city wouldn't be able to stay peaceful during the war. Now, elsewhere in Bosnia, when people left their properties, either through choice or because they were fleeing persecution or they were forcibly evicted, their properties were very often taken over by people from a different ethnic group. Now, that didn't happen in Tuzla. In Tuzla, if somebody chose to leave, nobody was forcibly evicted, but if people decided to leave, their empty properties were sealed by the local authorities, and so that they were protected and they remained empty, and they were there for them if they chose to return at the end of the war. Engagement of local people was key throughout, and everybody, as I say, bought into this concept of multi-ethnicity, of this diverse multi-ethnic city. So all community groups were multi-ethnic: professional bodies, sports clubs, cultural and educational associations, community groups. They were all multi-ethnic. Religious organizations obviously were allowed maintain their religious identity, but no community group was single ethnicity. People from different ethnic groups lived amongst each other. There weren't segregated areas of the city where the Muslims lived, the Croats lived, the Serbs lived. Everybody was intermingled. And local people took responsibility for maintaining this diversity, this multi-ethnic social identity, and they would intervene when they came across people using polarizing or radical or nationalistic language. They saw it as everybody's responsibility, not only the responsibility of the authorities. As far as possible, everybody tried to keep life as normal as possible during the war in Tuzla. And so delivery of basic services carried on as much as possible. Schools were kept open as much as possible, and when they couldn't, lessons were delivered over the radio. Now that might sound horribly familiar to those of you that have been involved in homeschooling in the last few months. Factories were kept open, cafes and restaurants were kept open as much as possible. And business leaders and industry leaders very much were part of this maintaining the multi-ethnic identity. They were very civic minded, and so not only did they employ people from all the ethnicities, but they also took trouble to ensure that people had access to their goods and services, people from all ethnicities, particularly during the war when so things, particularly food, was short. They would make sure that everybody that needed it could access their services and their goods. Events were held to celebrate the city's diversity. So people from the city would celebrate each other's religious events. They would get to know the correct date and the correct time of day when events would take place. They'd learn the language to use to greet each other on those special occasions. They'd learn what food to eat, and even go beyond that, they'd learn how to cook it, often cooking food together and then eating together. So everybody would celebrate each other's festivals, whether it was Orthodox Christmas or Easter or Eid. There were secular cultural events too that brought the city together. The mayor formed an orchestra and asked it to compose some patriotic songs to keep the spirits up of the people of Tuzla. There was the wartime Olympics. And the city took trouble to celebrate and reinforce positive images and experiences from their past that really celebrated their multi-ethnic identity. And this was quite different from other places in Bosnia, where a lot of events took place to really highlight one ethnicity, one nationality over another, how one group had dominated over another or victimized another group. That didn't happen in Tuzla. The media was very important. Local media continually promoted unity and social cohesion and inter-ethnic cooperation, and also played a role in dismissing and challenging rumours, the rumours that were rife. As well as working collaboratively with colleagues and other leaders in Tuzla, the mayor in particular also maintained relations external to the city. So in particular, he maintained relations with the president of Bosnia and other leaders who were based in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, and they were far more radical than he was. They were from the Muslim party, which was far more radical, and they did put pressure on him at times to abandon his multi-ethnic stance and promote a much more pro-Muslim form of nationalism. And he resisted this, but he still maintained those relations because this was the president of Bosnia, so it was important to maintain those relations. He also formed alliances and collaborations with moderates in opposing camps. So with some of the more nationalistic groups out there. And at international level, he regularly wrote to the United Nations, asking for help, asking for support for humanitarian aid, asking for support to stop the shelling that was taking place on the city. And at one point, he even wrote to President Clinton, asking him not to pursue the nationalistic agenda that the international community was supporting as part of the peace plan. So alongside all of this, on the one hand, he was writing to the leader of the free world, and on the other hand, he was still walking the streets of Tuzla and talking to and listening to the ordinary people that lived in the city. So although there were a lot of components to maintain peace, there were a lot of things that the people of Tuzla couldn't control, and there were some shocks, there were some stressors to their multi-ethnic identity and their multi-ethnic harmony. One of these was that quite early on in the war, one of the Orthodox churches in Tuzla was badly damaged by a shell. And the mayor immediately called on all the workers, construction workers that were working across the city and involved in repair work to come and help repair the church. He said, this church belongs to all of the citizens of Tuzla, and we cannot allow anyone from outside to destroy it. In other words, this wasn't something that just affected part of Tuzlan society. If it affected some people from the city, it affected everybody. This was an attack from outside on our city, and it affected everybody. And the workers of all ethnicities did come and meet the mayor's request and repaired the church. And they worked through the night, often putting themselves at risk. They worked under spotlights, maybe attracting more attention from the Serb forces outside, but they did come together. I mentioned about the role of the local media. And very early on in the war, a Muslim nationalist newspaper sprung up called Samaj. And this was something that was receiving quite a lot of support from the more radical Muslims based in Sarajevo. And this paper was designed to promote a very pro-Muslim and anti-Serb rhetoric. Now, other local newspapers responded. They published letters and articles from citizens who were speaking out against this radicalization. They galvanized the support amongst civil society. Civil society responded by, of all things, graffiti appeared around the city. Nowadays, it might be more social media, but then it was graffiti challenging this rise in radicalism and really promoting the inter-ethnic, multi-ethnic social identity, celebrating their diversity. And a civil society group called the Forum of Tuzla Citizens was formed very quickly, and this included a range of prominent high-profile Tuzlans, but also ordinary citizens, and it reached a membership of more than 15,000 people. That's about more than 10% of the population of Tuzla, and this was all about promoting their unity, their diverse ethnic identity and their unity. And the authorities, some of whom had been buckling under this pressure of rising radicalization from within Tuzla, they responded to this surge of civil society response and clamped down on this on this newspaper and the rise in radical Muslim voices in the city. Because Tuzla was known to be a safe place, was known to be resisting ethnic cleansing and ethnic tension, it became a destination for displaced people from elsewhere in Bosnia, particularly Muslims who had suffered at the hands of Serbian forces. So understandably, as displaced people came in, they may have brought with them some strong anti-Serb sentiment amongst them. And by the end of 1993, there were about 70,000 displaced people in the city. So that was more than 50% of the size of Tuzla to start with before the war. Now, the authorities and the people of Tuzla made it very clear that the displaced people were welcome, and they provided support. They gave them shelter, they gave them food when they could. But they also made it very clear that radicalization, divisive language, acts of revenge were not tolerated. And if they stayed, they bought into this multi-ethnic identity of the city. And most people accepted that. Some couldn't, and they left. Now, very sadly, towards a sad day for Tuzlans was towards the end of the war in May 1995. A shell hit a particular area of the city centre where young people used to hang out, and 71 young people were killed and 240 others injured. And these were young people from all ethnicities. And very quickly, the mayor and the parents of those killed and the religious leaders got together and decided that these young people would all be buried together. They'd lived together, they'd played together, they were killed together, they would be buried together, regardless of their religious or ethnic background. Now, the funeral was not well publicised, and it was held very early in the morning. And this was so as not to attract further attention and further shelling. But even so, several thousand Tuzlans attended the ceremony to show their respects. And the ceremony was jointly led by leaders from all three religions. So I hope this has given a flavour of the range of factors that enabled Tuzla to remain peaceful and to maintain its diverse multi-ethnic identity and values in spite of enormous pressures to do otherwise. And I think it's worth taking a moment just to reflect on just how much trust there must have been in the city for Serbs in particular to remain living in the city without fear of reprisals, and for Muslims to resist these pressures from outside the city to become more radical, and for actually all of the citizens of Tuzla to remain living there in really difficult conditions. They were being shelled by outside forces, they were often suffering food shortages, they were living in increasingly overcrowded conditions, and many had the opportunity to leave, but they chose to stay because for them, their role and their identity was completely defined by maintaining the city's diverse, trusting and multi-ethnic identity, and they could only do that if they stayed living in the city. And although everybody from civic authorities, ordinary citizens, sports clubs, cultural groups, businesses, industry, everybody played a role in promoting and maintaining the city as this trusting and diverse place to live, there's no doubt that the leadership of Mayor Bezlacic played a key role. And I'm pleased to say that he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't receive it, but he was nominated. So thank you. I'll hand back to Amanda now.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that really interesting